Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
Welcome to today's program, and this week and next week we're going to do another book. We like doing books and their authors and our review of them, and it's been a very popular topic with you. I'm pleased to welcome to the program today an author that wrote a book called A Prairie Heart, and it's by Sheila Wood. I have a copy here with me, and it's got a lovely design on it. And she's a very good friend, and for many years she taught English at North Idaho College as one of my colleagues and a faculty member. And Sheila, it's great seeing you again and having you here. And you have a wonderful story to tell in this book, going back to the Scandinavian countries and your grandmother and how this all evolved into dolls. And we showed those and introducing the program, so welcome.
Thank you very much, Tony.
And I'm so pleased to have our two regular panelists. First of all, Janelle Burke, who's an attorney in the state of Idaho. And next to her is Erna Reinhardt, who's Director of Public Relations at North Idaho College. And Janelle will commence today's questioning.
Welcome to the program, Sheila. Yes, I can attest to the fact that you were a very fine teacher. I think you were one of my son's teachers, and when he was in grade school. But you also had a wonderful grandmother, and you have a granddaughter as well. And as we talked just briefly before the program, grandmothers and granddaughters have a very special bond. So you had a special bond with your grandmother. What did you call her, and what was she like?
I just called her Grandma. And when I knew her, I have a picture here of her and taken of her with me in our backyard in Seattle. I grew up in Seattle. I was born and grew up in Seattle, and my mother was born in Seattle as well. Grandmother had emigrated from Norway in 1893, and after some years ended up in Seattle, and where she was married and had her family. But this is what she was. This is how I knew her, I guess I should say. She was 70 when I was born, and I only knew her as Grandma. But one of the insights, I think, of the aging process is to realize that just as the person that you see in the mirror is the image that looks back at you as a surprise, that you're not that person. This is how I knew her, but here she is in her wedding dress. And this is who my grandmother really was, you know. And I think it's taken all these years for me to be a grandmother myself to realize how much more there was to her story. I've returned, I guess you could say I have returned to her story through my own granddaughters. They have given me a purpose. And that's where my little endeavor came from. It was simply the dolls and the book were a way for me to pass on my grandmother's story and her legacy. And it just sort of got out of hand. People heard about it and wanted dolls, and then it just grew kind of organically over about a 5-year period. But if you don't know anything about my grandmother, it would seem that all I did was make some dolls for my granddaughters. And that's not it at all. I read once that in the life of every child, there is someone who comes along and opens the door to the future and sets the direction, sets the course for that child. And just as I hope that I'm able to do something of that nature for my granddaughters, my grandmother did that for her family. And it's her example of taking a bold journey that is the unifying myth of our family, our big Norwegian family in Seattle. And it was her journey and her story that I grew up listening to all about it. She was born in a little town in Norway called Ålesund. You can still find it on a map. I understand some of my cousins traced their roots and went back there, and I understand that it's a ski resort now, but that's where Grandma was born. Her father was the postmaster of this little village, and when she was a little girl, he sent to America for a very special gift for her, and that was a Singer sewing machine. And in 1893, when she emigrated, she was only 19. She didn't speak any English. And she left Norway never to see her parents again. She was an only child, or at least, as far as we know, the only living child that they had. And when you think about it, in 1893, that means she never heard their voices again. She never saw them again. That's the kind of courage she had to get on that ship. We know that she came on the Allen Line, and we know that she landed at Ellis Island. And we know that the passage was paid for her and for the sewing machine to Minnesota. So she came to America with a suitcase of clothes and a sewing machine, and that was all she had, and not a word of English.
And that we'll let Erna pick up at that point.
Well, let's continue to learn more about Grandma before we get into the books and the dolls, because she is the real center point, I think.
She is.
So how did she went to Minnesota? Do you know why she went
to
there?
Minnesota. You know, those are years that I don't know anything about. I pick up on her story when she came to Seattle. My mother, of course, has told me all about how the way that a young immigrant girl could learn English was by keeping house for someone. And so she kept house in a series of homes around Seattle and Tacoma. And she was in a religious revival meeting in a mission where my grandfather was playing the violin, and that's how she met him. He was actually a concert violinist, but of course you can't make any money doing that, and so he had a job changing truck tires, I think. But Mother remembers always how every Saturday night he used to get the violin out and rosin the bow and take the children to Sunday school every Sunday where he played the violin. But anyway, that's how they met and married. And the first year they lived on a float house in Elliott Bay. And then grandmother was expecting her first child, my Uncle Lawrence. So grandfather built her a house on 22nd Avenue West. And I will never forget that house because we lived there until I was 4 years old. My parents were living in Alaska when my mother expected me. And she did not want to raise a child there. She wanted to come home to Seattle, but it was 1942 and the war was going on and there was a housing shortage. So we lived with my grandmother. So I have very vivid memories of her and her funny house, which was, you know, like a museum of delights to a child. Because every time Grandma had another child, she had 5, grandfather added some little corner or niche or bedroom or bathroom. And so it was a fascinating little house.
So Sheila, how much time did you spend with your mom growing up, and what kind of lasting, obviously she's left you with a great legacy, but what were some of the characteristics about her that became so important to you?
Well, it was through her story that Mother would tell and retell, and Mother inherited that sewing machine. It was, you probably have seen them in antique stores with the treadle. It's really kind of symbolic of my grandmother's whole life. I mean, everything is so easy for us now. I don't mean that life essentially is easy, but I mean that the management of daily life is so easy. There was no such word as ergonomics when my grandmother was a young woman. Everything was difficult. The management of daily life was difficult and fraught with danger. And my mother used to point to that sewing machine. It was sat in the corner of our home in Seattle, and she would say, "Your grandmother had gumption. She got on that boat speaking not a word of English. She was an only child. She left her parents, and she had the courage to come to America and establish our family here. And if it wasn't for your grandmother, we wouldn't be here." And so grandmother put her stamp of identity on us. We were the family that came from the immigrant ancestor who had gumption. It was the bold journey. It was stepping out into the unknown, having the courage to do that, that became the unifying myth of our family. And I believe that all of her descendants, in one way or another, there's tremendous amount of talent in our family, a lot of musical talent. And one cousin was in a Broadway play, and we all, you know, we've all taken our own bold journeys. Not as bold as grandmother's, but we had a standard to live up to.
Wow.
On that note, I know that our viewers would like to see some photographs we have, and our staff's been wonderful. Kyle in particular put these together for us, and so up on the screen as the first one.
That's my grandmother and I, and that must have been taken when I was about 8 or 9, it's not dated. She would have been close to 80. She was 70 when I was born.
That's a wonderful one. And then we'll go to the next one.
This is a picture of my grandmother, and I like those two photos juxtaposed, or one after the other, because here's grandmother when she was probably the same age I was in that first picture that you looked at.
With her parents.
With her parents, that's Ludwig and Olina. He was the postmaster.
And the next one is?
That's her confirmation photo when she was 15.
So great those were preserved, and here.
And here she is as a young woman.
In Seattle, of course, at this point, I assume.
And there she is in her wedding dress.
And then I believe we have one more.
This is her family. These are her 5 children. On the top left is my Aunt Marion, my Uncle Lawrence, the only boy, my Aunt Jo, my mother, down below my Uncle Lawrence, right between my Uncle Lawrence and my Aunt Jo, and then there's my Aunt May, the baby of the family, who is now 93.
Oh, good genes. With that, we're going to move to your book, because you have a beautiful story leading up to it, and the panel did a wonderful job. And again, it's called A Prairie Heart by you, and then it was illustrated by Diane Nolan. And I just think it's a wonderful book. Start us out by telling us, you know, you've already said about your granddaughters reminded you what you need to do and all, and then the book started. Tell us about that process and what is, we'll get, next week we'll even get into more detail, but tell us about how you did it and something about the table of contents, what all is in this book.
The dolls actually preceded the book.
Okay.
What happened was that I happened to be babysitting for my granddaughters, and I think Chloe was 3 and Sky would have been about 7. And in spite of how important my grandmother was to my growing up years, truly I hadn't thought about her very much over all the years of raising a family and going to school and getting graduate degrees and my job at NIC and all the things that happened during my life. But a wonderful thing happens with retirement. I highly recommend it. It's all of the past, all of your experiences have been percolating throughout the years. And in retirement, you have that kind of solitude, or at least I had the kind of solitude. And I am a writer. I'm not a professional writer, but I do love to write. And I think for writers, that it's the distillation of that experience that makes it possible for us to create something. And so I was babysitting for these 2 little girls in my daughter's lovely Spokane South Hill home. It was a snowy day, I remember. It was snowing outside. And Chloe reached up and flicked on the fire, a gas log fire, and Sky went into the toy room, which is full of toys, and brought out this big plastic tub of Barbie dolls, which I always call Barbie stew. That's what it looks like to me. It's all these little accessories, the little purses and shoes, and all these dolls and clothes and everything. And I don't know what happened, but it's that distillation of experience. I looked at all of it and I thought, I wonder what a doll that my grandmother might have played with would look like.
So the creation of the dolls were based on your imagination, what that she might have had?
What she might have played with. Well, I just watched them playing with those Barbie dolls, and maybe it was the fire. You know, I think about my grandmother's kitchen. Her kitchen was the heart of her home, and that big commanding presence was that cast iron stove. And Mother tells stories about how when she and her brother and sisters were little, the first thing they had to do when they came home from school was to go out and bring in the wood and coal and keep that fire burning. It was like the heart of the home, and they had to keep that heart beating with constantly stoking it. But all Chloe had to do was flip a switch. And it was the contrast between the life that my grandmother had and the life that I saw my grandchildren having. It's not that I would want them to have to live that life, but to realize that they've never been too hot in the summer because they have air conditioning and they have air-conditioned cars. And they've never been too cold in the winter because they have a furnace. And I just think about how grandmother lived, and I guess I feel like, kind of like the bridge between grandmother's generation. I believe that my generation may be among the last to really be in contact with the pioneer generations. I mean, immigrants are coming every day to America, but the ones who actually had to establish the bedrock, the foundation for the American dream, our generation, I include you, Janelle, we are in physical contact with them. We knew them. I sat with her. I heard her stories. I knew her. And it felt important to me to somehow pass on that legacy to my grandchildren, because I'm afraid in this world of such great ease and push button and cell phones and Blackberries and Bluetooths and this digital generation, I'm afraid that what grandmother knew and believed in is going to be lost. And I'm especially concerned with the way some of her values have been turned into handy little commercial jingles. Like I mentioned in the newspaper article that was written that my husband and I were in a shoe store where across the entire perimeter of the top of the wall it said, "Love thy sneaker, love thy sneaker, love thy sneaker." And it's not the sacrilegious aspect or anything like that. It's that there's something about the value being exploited for its commercial value that makes me wonder just what my grandchildren will be taking on into this brave new world that they're inhabiting.
There's a book written called The Tipping Point.
Oh,
You
yes.
may be familiar with that. And for individuals and for countries, there are tipping points. And in his book, he talks a lot about, for a country, something happens in some locality and the whole country takes on that, but also it's individuals. So for you, this was your tipping point for this book. It's the dolls first and then this book. And it's not something you plan, it just happens at that moment.
It just happened.
Yeah. One more question back to the panel, and that is really powerful, that you were the connection between your grandmother and your grandchildren, but and that's really important. But what they can have that you did, they cannot have the personal experience. They did not get to know her. But this is the second best thing you can do for them, is to make that connection that way.
Well, watching them play, and I've taught, as Janelle pointed out, I've also taught elementary school, and I know that play is a child's whole work. It's their 9-to-5 job, and that they explore and try out different identities through play. And I just felt like I could give them more than a desire to look like a Barbie doll. Not that I have anything against Barbie. The whole story of the development of that toy is a story of American entrepreneurship. It's a wonderful story. But I thought to myself, if I could find a doll like the one she played with, perhaps I could teach them about their grandmother, not just by telling them, but more intuitively through play. And so I went shopping, and everything I found was what I call country kitsch, just caricatures. But I wanted character. And so I had to dust off my own gumption. I didn't have a sewing machine, and all I had was 9th grade sewing. I mean, I taught English all those years. I wasn't sewing clothes, you know. But I heard through a friend that there was someone who had a $100 Singer sewing machine at a garage sale. So I bought it, and I was so ignorant about how it worked at first that it came in a table. I didn't even know how to get it out of the table. I took the table and the machine and everything up to the man on 4th Street at Coeur d'Alene, sewing back, and he for $50, he repaired, put on new belts and whatnot, and he said, "These things will run forever. All the parts are metal." And so then I shopped for a pattern and some fabric, and I wish I had kept the first doll that I made, because when I turned her right side out, her arms were trapped inside her body. I had to throw that one away. But I kept persisting with my gumption. And
your grandmother's.
My grandmother's gumption. And I finally came out with a doll that was acceptable, and I made another one. And I found some doll furniture, and I made a bunch of clothes. And for Chloe's 4th birthday, I set it all up in the living room, and when the little girls came in, I can still hear them squeal. They were thrilled with those dolls. And that's primarily how it started, until I took a doll to my friend Diane Nolan, who is an artist and a seamstress. And I said, Diane, I told her the whole story, and I said, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could teach our grandchildren not just through this doll, but what if we had a whole series of dolls and we named each doll after one of the immigrant virtues? And we could call them Prairie Virtue Dolls. And she said, that's a wonderful idea. And she had, in 24 hours, I think, she had a list of 20 virtues. And she said, you choose 10, and I'll choose 10, and you make 10 dolls, and I'll make 10 dolls. And that's what we have done ever since.
It's an helper.
Well, I certainly can identify. We have one of those sewing machines at home, too.
Oh, do you?
My husband's great-grandmother's sewing machine. But yes, I certainly can identify, and my grandparents were very much the same age as yours. So they gave us wonderful gifts. Can you share with us one of the gifts or some of the gifts that your grandmother gave to you? Perhaps your
Sure.
Bible.
When I was was probably in the summer when I was 11 years old, grandmother and I were sitting together alone, and she asked me, she never had a very good command of the English language, and she said, I couldn't understand her very well a lot of times, so she said, does yous mama and yous papa teach you about Yesu? And I said, no, I don't think so. And she said, yous mama and yous papa doesn't teach you about Yesu? And I said, no, I don't think so, Grandma. And my mother happened to walk in then, and she just practically, it was a meltdown. And June, my mother's name is June, you's not teaching Sheila about Yesu. And my mother said, oh, yes, we take her to Sunday school. She looked at me, she said, she means Jesus. So that Christmas, I got my first Bible, and you can see how dog-eared it is. I've moved many times over the last... I'll be 65 in June, and I got this when I was 11. So,
is it King James Version?
It is King James. Oh yes, and it says in it, "To Sheila Clay by Grandma, December 25th, 1953." She was taking no chances about my future.
And she did talk to you. I'm sure she told you stories that had morals to them. At least my grandmother told me many stories that had sort of morals to them. They were about real people. They were about family members or neighbors or whatever. But they had morals to them. What I should do, what I shouldn't do, according to what those folks had done.
You know, she loved listening to evangelists on the radio. There was no TV yet. And I remember she had terrible arthritis, and the evangelist on the radio told her to put her hand on the radio and it would cure her arthritis, and she swore that that actually had happened. But she had some rules, and one of her rules was that you never played a game on Sunday. And she loved board games, and so...
But not on Sunday.
Not on Sunday. She loved Sorry, a game called Sorry, and she would play that with me by the hour. And every Sunday my father would pick her up from her home and bring her up for dinner. And I would say, Grandma, will you please play one game of Sorry with me? No, we doesn't play games on the Lord's Day. Just one game, Grandma, just one... No. And I'd please, 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 please. And finally she'd say, Val, just one. She wanted to play too.
Erna Reinhardt.
We're going to talk next week in more detail about your book and about your dolls. But before this show gets over, I want you to just share with our viewers and with us the one virtue that is your favorite and the doll that goes with that virtue.
And I believe there's 20 dolls that you have.
My favorite doll she is on the right-hand side down there in a green dress, and her name is Penitence. And I love her because she makes mistakes, and she has tremendous remorse over all the mistakes that she makes. And
that's her there.
There she is.
Yeah.
That's Penny, Penitence. I love her story. I'm very proud of her story that I wrote about her. And she's probably my alter ego because I'm the kind of person who's made lots of mistakes and have great remorse over them, but feel forgiven, and we go on.
And they have the contact websites up on there. You might verbalize those too.
Yes, if people are interested in seeing all the dolls and seeing them in detail, if they're on the internet, they can go to www.prairievirtuedolls.com, And they can email me at prairieheart@earthlink.net.
Now you are using modern technology to help tell the story of your grandmother.
I am.
Isn't that wonderful? How you made that connection.
Yes,
And so that is
for
wonderful. Go ahead, Arno. You have other questions?
Can you tell us a little bit about that story in your book, from your
About
book?
the penitence? Oh, I'd love to. Can I have my book for a
Surely,
moment?
surely.
And Diane, who illustrated, my partner who illustrated this story, she loves this illustration more than all the others. And isn't that interesting that I love the story the most and she loves the illustration?
That's amazing.
Oh, you both
Cute.
have, that's your favorite?
It's our favorite. Well, penitence is a little girl who always gets in trouble. And the first sentence says, "Penitence," her mother declared sternly, "you must learn to think before you do these things." And what she did was she reached up to touch this China lady that her mother had brought with her on her immigrant journey. And she tipped it over and it broke into many, many pieces. And she gets in terrible trouble, and her big sister Prudence scolds her. And she decides, Prudence says, "Don't you realize that was Mother's dream, that someday she would have a lovely home and she would have a china cabinet and she would be able to put the China lady in that cabinet. And now you've broken it and you're so naughty and you knew you weren't supposed to touch it." And so Penitence decides that her family would be better off without her, so she runs away. And I don't know how much you want to know about this story.
Well, we don't have much time left. We have less than 2 minutes, but you're a great storyteller. But next week we are going to talk about those, and it's my understanding that
Great.
you have all 20 dolls in the book.
I do.
There's a part on each one, just like you did with this conversation with those.
Yes.
And we will certainly pick up with that next week. Isn't that a great bridge for next week, for our viewers to come back? Ladies and gentlemen, we so enjoyed having our friend with us today, Sheila Wood, and her wonderful book.
Thank you.
About her dolls and about her grandmother, and we're going to have her back next week because we just got really into the book, and she's going to do some more reading from that and another book that she has here that she was not author of, and I know that you've been just so entertained and also moved by this wonderful story of a great immigrant that brought about a family that has affected where they've lived very, very much, as Sheila has here. And so I hope you'll be with us again next week when we'll deal with that. I just think it's just a wonderful story. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.